Making your dream game isn't an easy task, and for a long time I really struggled with it. I had the wrong approach, focused on too many unnecessary mechanics and lost track of my original vision. But some months ago I logged in, started working more efficiently and kept things straightforward. And now the game is finally coming together. It feels less and less like a prototype and more like the game I always wanted to make. If you're new to the channel, my dream game is an isometric shooter about defending your RV, which also acts as your base from enemies in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. In my last devlog I implemented map generation, a mission selector, as well as several mission goals. However, completing those missions didn't reward you with anything yet, and I promised I was going to change that. So, in this video I am going to add a proper reward system for completing missions and objectives, as well as new items and several ways to store loot and belongings. But before we get to that, I had to fix some issues left over from the last devlog. In the previous video I implemented a basic map generation, but I completely forgot to add houses or other props. So all we had was a boring street layout. It was pretty dumb of me to forget such an important part of the system, so I quickly added street lights to each map tile and set up spawn points for houses. I had made these houses a while ago, so they weren't anything new or exciting. I also added a slider to the mission class that lets me set building density for each map. Setting the slider to 0 spawns no houses at all, while setting it to 1 spawns a house on every possible spawn point. And wow, this looked incredibly dystopian. I only came back to the map generation briefly to fix the issue of having no houses, but I know it still needs a lot of work. The houses barely have variety, there are lots of empty green spaces, and the maps all look too repetitive. I will definitely return to this feature soon, so stay tuned. With those issues out of the way, it was finally time to focus on new content. In the last video I promised to add a reward and loot system, since completing missions didn't offer the player any rewards at the moment. I could have just made a boring victory screen, but I don't like relying on bland UI elements. Instead, I decided to create destructible loot boxes for players to find scattered around the map during missions. I made two types of boxes, a cardboard box and a metal box. It was already fun to mess around with them even before I added the destruction mechanic. After some coding and animating, I set up a simple destruction system where each box has health points. The cardboard box has 1 health point, while the sturdier metal box has 5 health points. Luckily I had already written a script that makes enemies drop random items upon death, so I reused it for the loot boxes. I can assign any items to a box's loot table and adjust the drop rates. Now we had destructible loot boxes and a working loot table, but not much item variety beyond some basic guns and 2 types of magazines. So I spent some time drawing new items that could later be used for crafting, such as scrap metal, batteries and circuit boards. After implementing them into the game, I realized I had made them way too big. The player looked ridiculous carrying around this huge pile of scrap metal. So I went back and redrew them smaller. While the smaller versions have less detail, they now look properly scaled next to the player. I assigned some of these new items to the loot boxes. Cardboard boxes now have a chance to drop magazines or random items, while metal boxes always drop something. Since metal boxes take more effort to destroy, I thought that was a fair deal. Next, I set up loot box spawners around the map. I added 4 possible spawn points to each building and sliders in the mission class to easily adjust spawn rates in the Unity editor. With random loot boxes now appearing in missions, the game finally has a passive reward system. As I mentioned earlier, I also wanted to add other ways to reward the player, such as a currency that could be used to buy items or guns. But first, another problem came up. The player only has 5 inventory slots, and with all these new items you quickly run out of space. But what if you want to carry more items over the long term? My solution was to add a backpack style storage system and a storage container inside the RV. I started by adding 2 new items, a small and a medium storage crate. At first they didn't do anything, but my plan was to give them extra inventory slots so players could store items inside. Setting this up was much harder than I expected. It took me several days and I even broke the game once or twice. But after fixing everything, the system now works as intended. You can pick up storage items like normal, left click them to open or close their extra inventory space, and move items around however you like. You can also quickly store an item by grabbing it and clicking the storage crate without opening it. The only restrictions I added were that you can't put storage items inside other storage items, and you also can't store weapons, mainly for realism and balance. Another important feature I promised at the beginning of the video was adding storage to the RV. Since the RV acts as the player's base, it needed a proper place to store loot after missions. I decided to turn the suitcase that had always been sitting in the RV into the storage container. I drew a zoomed in version of the suitcase and made it accessible to the player during gameplay. I gave the suitcase 27 slots for now, since there aren't that many items in the game yet. I reused the code from the storage items, made some tweaks and ran into all sorts of cursed bugs. At one point you could merge different items into one, but you couldn't stack multiple items of the same kind. At another point, accessing the storage made you unable to use guns. After some debugging, I fixed all of that and polished up the display. Now everything works perfectly. You can now store anything you want to keep after missions. Guns, magazines or crafting materials. The only things you can't store are other storage items, because I want players to manage their storage wisely. Finally, I added a new item, coins. These act as currency and can be found inside loot boxes. You might be wondering what you will be able to use them for, and that leads me to my next point. In this devlog we added rewards in the form of loot boxes, a currency, a bunch of new items and new ways to store them. Loot boxes already make missions more fun, but there is still a lot missing. In the next video I want to drastically improve how missions play out by adding new enemies, polishing objectives and creating more things to explore and interact with. I also want to add a merchant so you can spend your coins on weapons and items between missions. And of course, sooner or later we will need a crafting system to actually use all these new items. If you are curious about the game's future, make sure to subscribe. If you want to support me, also leave a like as well as some feedbacks in the comments. And if you would like, you can also support me on Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the description. Thanks a lot for watching, have a great day and see you next time.